In the early summer of 1943, the transport ship USS Henry Gibbons pulled into Norfolk Naval Base. On the outside, it looked like any other military ship returning from war. But inside, hidden below the deck, was a secret that would expose 3 years of carefully maintained deception. Packed into the dim were 847 German prisoners of war, soldiers from the Afrika Korps, survivors from sunken U-boats, and Luftwaffe airmen shot down over Tunisia. They stood silently, steadying themselves as the ship's engine slowed and the long journey finally came to an end. They had spent 17 days crossing the Atlantic, crammed into converted cargo spaces that still smelled of grain and diesel. The voyage had been brutal. Seasickness, exhaustion, and the constant uncertainty of what awaited them on American soil. In the hold, Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, a 23-year-old crewman from Stuttgart, steadied himself against a steel beam. His face bore the hollowed look of men who had seen too much combat and too little food. Whispered conversations around him died as the ship's anchor chain rattled into the water. What came next was nothing none of them were prepared for. The hatch swung open, and a blast of cold American daylight poured into the dark hold. Guards in neat olive-green uniforms climbed down the ladder, rifles resting loosely on their shoulders. There was no yelling or show of force, just a smooth, practiced routine. One sergeant carrying a clipboard started calling out names. His German was so flawless. Hartmann stared. The man's tone was calm and professional, nothing like the furious, vengeful Americans German propaganda had warned them about. Instead, this was something far more unnerving. The prisoners were not hated. They were handled. As the men climbed onto the deck, the reality of their situation hit them hard. The Norfolk port stretched out in front of them, massive and almost unreal. Giant cranes moved shipping containers as big as train cars. Rows of enormous ships sat at the docks, many larger than any destroyer Hartmann had seen in Bremerhaven. Sparks flashed from welding torches in the distance, and the entire harbor vibrated with the steady roar of a country that had turned its industry into a war machine. This was their new world. It is bigger, colder, and far more powerful than anything they had imagined. Hartmann couldn't stop staring. He had fought in North Africa, where supply columns were bombed into scrap by Allied fighters, and where every liter of fuel was rationed with desperate precision. Here, forklifts moved crates of ammunition like groceries. One of the prisoners, a former U-boat engineer named Erich Schneider, muttered under his breath, "Hamburg looks like a village compared to this." It wasn't hyperbole. Hamburg was Germany's largest port, and it was being systematically reduced to rubble by RAF Bomber Command. But even before the firestorms, it had been a fraction of this. Norfolk Naval Base, in 1943, was processing more cargo in a single week than Germany's entire Baltic fleet could move in a month. The prisoners were marched down the gangway and onto American soil. Their boots, worn thin from months of desert combat, clattered against pristine concrete. The dockworkers barely glanced at them. Men in overalls, wearing leather work gloves, hauled cargo with the practiced ease of people who had never known hunger. Some of them were white. Some of them were black. Hartmann froze mid-step. A white foreman was shouting instructions to a black worker operating a crane. The black man nodded, adjusted a lever, and swung a pallet of steel beams into position. No hesitation. Just work. This was impossible. Under the Reich's laws, such a scene was not merely forbidden, it was unthinkable. The Nuremberg laws had racial hierarchy in every corner of German life. Here, in the heart of the American war machine, the rules were different. Or perhaps there were no rules at all. Schneider, standing beside Hartmann, whispered, "Die spinnen die Amerikaner." The Americans are crazy. It became a refrain. a bitter, bewildered joke that would follow them through the processing lines and the long, strange months ahead. The prisoners were herded into a massive warehouse that had been converted into a processing center. Inside, rows of folding tables were staffed by officers, translators, and medical personnel. The air smelled of disinfectant and fresh paint. The walls were lined with posters in German explaining the Geneva Convention rules in simple, direct language. Hartmann's group was directed to a table where a middle-aged American officer sat reviewing documents. The officer looked up and asked for his name, rank, and unit in perfect German. Hartmann gave his information, still half expecting a trap. The officer wrote it down without comment, then slid a sheet across the table. Told him it was a summary of his rights under the Geneva Convention. He will be treated according to international law, paid for any labor performed, and receive the same medical care as American soldiers. Hartmann understood them, but he did not believe them. That evening, the prisoners were issued clean uniforms, surplus American fatigues dyed blue-gray to mark them as POWs. They were given soap, towels, and toothbrushes. They were shown to barracks with real beds, not wooden slats or straw pallets. In the mess hall, they were served hot food: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and white bread. The portions were generous, almost obscene. Hartmann sat at a long table, staring at his tray. He had not seen this much meat in a single meal since before the war. In the late 1943, German soldiers in Italy and Russia were subsisting on black bread, ersatz coffee, and whatever they could scavenge. Here, the enemy ate like kings. This was a nation so confident in its industrial strength that it could afford to feed its enemies without a second thought. The real shock came 3 days later when the prisoners were loaded onto a train bound for the interior. They were herded into passenger cars, not cattle cars or flatbeds, but actual civilian coaches with cushioned seats and windows that opened. Guards sat at either end of each car, rifles across their laps. But they did not watch the prisoners with the tense vigilance of men guarding dangerous enemies. They smoked cigarettes and read newspapers. The train rolled west through Virginia, crossing landscapes that seemed impossibly green and untouched by war. Farmland stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional town or factory. Hartmann pressed his face to the window, watching the world scroll past. What struck him first was the infrastructure. Roads, paved and smooth, ran parallel to the tracks. Telephone poles marched in perfect rows, their wires humming with communication. Bridges spanned rivers with the clean, functional elegance of a nation that had never known bombardment. Then came the factories. They were everywhere: steel mills, chemical plants, automotive assembly lines. And they were not hidden. Their names were painted in bold letters across their facades: Ford Motor Company, U.S. Steel, General Electric. The Americans did not fear sabotage or reconnaissance. They advertised their industrial might like a taunt. Hartmann watched workers streaming out of a factory at shift change. They carried lunchboxes and thermoses. They wore leather shoes, not wooden clogs. Some of them climbed into personal automobiles and drove away. Schneider, sitting beside him, muttered, "Look at that. They throw away half-eaten apples." It was true. Near a factory gate, a worker had tossed an apple core into a trash bin. The fruit was still mostly intact, just a few bites missing. Hartmann felt something twist in his chest. In Germany, food was rationed with brutal precision. Every calorie counted. Wasting food was not merely wasteful, it was criminal. Here, the Americans discarded more than most Germans ate. The train passed through a small town. Children played in a park. Women pushed strollers down tree-lined streets. A man on a bicycle waved at the train, not knowing that it carried enemy prisoners. On the third day of the camp, Hartmann had developed a persistent cough during the Atlantic crossing, and he was sent to the medical barracks for examination. The building was clean, modern, and stocked with supplies that would have been unthinkable in a German field hospital. Stainless steel examination tables, X-ray machines, cabinets filled with bandages, sulfa drugs, and most astonishingly, penicillin. Penicillin, the miracle drug. German military intelligence knew about it. They had intercepted reports from the front, where Allied soldiers recovered from infections that would have killed Axis troops. But Germany could not produce it in sufficient quantities. The chemical synthesis was too complex. But in America, it was stored in glass vials by the dozen. The doctor who examined Hartmann was a young man, probably in his late 20s, with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen countless patients and knew his work. The doctor listened carefully to Hartmann's lungs with a stethoscope, then calmly wrote out a prescription. It was an early-stage pneumonia diagnosis to be treated with penicillin. Hartmann could hardly process it. Penicillin, in Germany, was precious and reserved for officers or vital personnel, not for prisoners of war. The nurse who administered the injection was black. Hartmann stared. The man was wearing a U.S. Army Medical Corps uniform, clean and pressed, with corporal stripes on his sleeve. He moved with practiced efficiency, swabbing Hartmann's arm with alcohol and administering the injection without a word. It was not the fact that the man was black that shocked Hartmann. He had seen African soldiers in the French colonial units in North Africa. What shocked him was the uniform, the equality of function, the absence of segregation in this particular moment. The idea of a black man administering medical care to a white officer in the Wehrmacht would have been inconceivable. Hartmann left the infirmary in a daze. The injection site on his arm throbbed faintly, but his mind was elsewhere. The train journey continued. Days blurred into one another as the prisoners were transported deeper into the American interior. They passed through cities, each one larger and more prosperous than the last. What struck the prisoners most was the casual wealth, the everyday abundance of civilian life. In one town, the train stopped at a station to take on water. Prisoners were allowed to stretch their legs under guard. A vendor on the platform was selling newspapers, candy bars, and cigarettes. Children crowded around him, clutching nickels and dimes, chattering in English. One of the prisoners, a former schoolteacher named Otto Keller, watched in silence. Children had been conscripted into the Hitler Youth in Germany and trained to dig trenches or collect scrap metal. But here, they could buy candy. The train rolled on, through farmland and forests untouched by war. Hartmann continued to watch, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught. The Reich had promised them that Germany was destined to rule, that the Aryan race was superior. But the contradictions were winning. The ideological shock only deepened when the prisoners reached their final destination, a POW camp in rural Kansas. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but inside, the conditions were better than most German soldiers had experienced at the front. Barracks with electricity, hot showers, a library stocked with books in German, a canteen where prisoners could buy cigarettes and soap with the wages they earned from camp labor. Hartmann was assigned to a work detail on a nearby farm. Each morning, he and a dozen other prisoners were transported to where they picked vegetables alongside American civilian workers. The farmer who owned the land was a gruff, middle-aged man named Earl Thompson. He spoke no German, but he made his expectations clear through gestures and the occasional barked command. One afternoon, as they loaded crates of tomatoes onto a truck, Thompson launched into a tirade about Roosevelt and the War Production Board. He complained about price controls, rationing, and government bureaucrats who had never set foot on a farm, telling him how to run his business. The prisoners listened in stunned silence. This is something that can't be witnessed in Germany. Such open criticism of the Führer would have been treason. the Gestapo would have arrived within hours. But here, Thompson shouted his grievances to the sky, and nothing happened. That evening, back at the camp, the prisoners gathered in the common area and tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. The Americans were fighting a total war, mobilizing their entire economy, yet their civilians openly criticized their leaders without consequence. Keller, the former schoolteacher, summed it up as, "Their strength lies in their discord." It was a truth none of them had been prepared for. The Reich had demanded absolute unity, absolute obedience. Yet the Americans, who seemed to thrive on chaos, had built the most powerful war machine in history. By December 1943, Hartmann and thousands of German POWs like him had been distributed across more than 500 camps spanning the American heartland. His group arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, on a cold morning when the prairie wind cut through their thin uniforms like a blade. What they found defied every expectation. Camp Hearn was not a prison. It was a small city. The compound stretched across 700 acres of flat Texas grassland, enclosed by barbed wire and watchtowers. But inside, the infrastructure was stunning. Barracks built to American military specifications, not the temporary shelters they had known in Africa. Each building had electric lights. Hot water flowed from spigots in communal shower houses. The latrines were porcelain, not wooden trenches. In Germany, by late 1943, the civilian population was suffering under relentless Allied bombing and dwindling resources. Electricity was rationed. Hot water was a luxury reserved for the party elite. But in a prison camp for enemy combatants, the Americans provided amenities that exceeded what most Germans had known before the war. The camp was self-governed. They had installed a system where prisoners elected their own representatives, organized their own work details, and maintained their own discipline. The senior German officer, Krebs, acted as the liaison between the Artom, prisoners, and the American camp administration. It was a strange inversion of authority. The Americans gave the prisoners the tools to manage themselves, then stepped back and watched. The message was unmistakable. "We trust you to be civilized. Prove us wrong, and you lose this privilege." But most prisoners, exhausted and bewildered, simply complied. The real psychological operation began in January 1944 with the opening of the camp library. The building was modest, a converted barracks with shelves of raw pine lumber. But what sat on those shelves was revolutionary. They were books in German. Hundreds of them. Works by Goethe, Schiller, and Kant. But also Thomas Mann, whose books had been publicly burned by the Nazis in 1933. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, banned for its anti-war message. Hartmann discovered the library on a gray afternoon when rain drummed against the barracks roof, and there was nothing else to do. He wandered in, expecting propaganda pamphlets or technical manuals. Instead, he found a copy of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. He stood there holding the book. A while back, possessing this book would have been a death sentence for him. The Gestapo would have searched his home, arrested him, and sent him to a labor camp or worse. But it is sitting here on an open shelf, available to anyone who wants to read it. He checked it out. The American librarian, a bored-looking corporal who spoke no German, stamped the card without comment. He read late into the night, the electric bulb above his head casting a warm glow across the pages. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same. Men who had fought for the Third Reich were now reading the authors the Reich had condemned. Otto Keller, the former schoolteacher, became the library's most frequent visitor. He devoured books with the hunger of a man who had been starved of intellectual nourishment. But not all prisoners were susceptible to this quiet persuasion. Within the camp, divisions began to form. The hardcore Nazis, those who still believed in the Führer, the mission, the righteousness of the Reich, organized themselves into informal cells. They called themselves the Schwarze Schafe, the black sheep. They enforced discipline through intimidation, beating prisoners who questioned the party line, sabotaging the re-education efforts, and maintaining a rigid adherence to Nazi ideology. The Americans knew about them. Camp intelligence officers, fluent in German, monitored conversations, intercepted letters, and identified the ringleaders. Rather than crack down immediately, the Americans employed a subtler strategy. They isolated the black sheep in separate compounds, cutting them off from the general population. Then they flooded the remaining prisoners with educational materials, films, and lectures. The transformation rate was astonishing. By mid-1944, American analysts estimated that nearly 60% of prisoners had shifted from passive acceptance of Nazi ideology to active skepticism. Men who had fought for Hitler now questioned the foundational myths they had been taught. Hartmann found himself caught in the middle. He was not a fanatic, but neither was he a dissident. He had fought because he was ordered to. He had believed because he had been told to. Now, surrounded by books, debates, and the relentless evidence of American abundance, he simply did not know what to believe anymore. Christmas 1943 arrived cold and clear over the Texas prairie. The prisoners of Camp Hearn woke to frost on the barracks windows and the faint smell of wood smoke from the camp kitchens. They expected nothing. Christmas in the Wehrmacht had been a grim affair, brief religious services, and the constant awareness that death was never far away. And here in captivity, they assumed it would be worse. They were wrong. The morning began with an announcement. The camp commander, Colonel Denton, addressed the prisoners through an interpreter. His message was simple. The people of Hearn, Texas, had prepared something for them, and what followed was incomprehensible. By midday, trucks began arriving at the camp gates. Not military trucks, but civilian vehicles, pickups, flatbeds, even a horse-drawn wagon. They were loaded with packages, thousands of them, small cardboard boxes wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The townspeople of Hearn, population 2,000, had mobilized. Every family, every church, every civic organization had contributed. In total, they had assembled 4,800 individual gift packages for the German prisoners. Hartmann stood in line with the other prisoners as the packages were distributed. When his name was called, he stepped forward and accepted a small box. It was heavier than he expected. He carried it back to his bunk, sat down, and carefully untied the string. Inside it was a bar of soap, a razor, a toothbrush, a pack of cigarettes, hard candy, a small Bible, and a handwritten note in English. Hartmann could not read English well, but Keller, sitting nearby, translated. He read it as, "Merry Christmas. May God bless you and bring you home safely." It was from a family in Hearn, Texas called the Hendersons. Hartmann stared at the note. The Hendersons, a family he had never met. A family whose sons might be fighting Germans at that very moment, and they had given him a Christmas gift. Around him, prisoners opened their packages in stunned silence. Some wept. Others simply sat, holding the small items as if they were sacred relics. Schneider, tearing open a pack of cigarettes, laughed bitterly. It was unbelievable to see men who fought them 30 years ago giving them gifts. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, composed of men who had fought in the trenches of France. They had killed Germans then, and now they were feeding them. That evening, the camp administration announced a special event. The prisoners were led to the camp's assembly hall, a large wooden structure used for meetings and entertainment. Inside, the space had been transformed. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. Candles flickered on tables. And at the front of the hall, a choir from the local Methodist church waited. The prisoners filed in and sat on rows of wooden benches. They were confused, uncertain. The Americans had already given them more than they expected. What more could there be? The choir began to sing Silent Night in German. The amazement was physical. The American women sang the carol in flawless German, their voices clear and sincere. It was too much. Men who had endured combat and the long, grinding humiliation of defeat now broke. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads, shoulders shaking. A few tried to sing along, but could not force the words past the lump in their throats. These women had brothers and husbands fighting in Europe. And yet they stood here, singing Christmas carols in the language of the enemy, offering comfort where none was owed. When the carol ended, silence filled the hall. Then, slowly, the prisoners began to applaud. It was tentative at first, then louder, more sustained. The women smiled, some wiping away their own tears. After the choir finished, the prisoners were served Christmas dinner. The meal was obscene in its abundance. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls, and real coffee. The camp nutritionist later calculated the meal at approximately 5,000 calories per prisoner. The Americans had just fed them, their enemies more in a single meal than German families received in 4 days. Because civilian rations in Germany had been cut to 200 calories per day. By the spring of 1945, the character of the camps had fundamentally shifted. The war in Europe was ending. Hitler was dead. Germany was in ruins. And the prisoners, who had once been soldiers of the Reich, were now something else entirely. The statistics told the story. Across all American POW camps holding Germans, the escape attempt rate was 0.52%, not 5%, not even 1%, half of 1%. In camps holding Japanese prisoners, the rate was significantly higher. But the Germans, once they understood what captivity in America meant, had no desire to leave. Labor participation was voluntary, yet 87% of prisoners chose to work. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, cut timber in Oregon. They were paid in camp scrip, which they used to buy cigarettes, candy, and other small luxuries from the camp canteen. Some prisoners saved their earnings and sent money home to families in Germany. The transformation was profound. Men who had arrived as committed Nazis now openly questioned the ideology that had led them to war. Hartmann, lying in his bunk one evening, found himself thinking about the farm outside Stuttgart, where he had grown up. He thought about his parents, his younger sister, and wondered if they were still alive. He thought about the books in the library, the Christmas carols, the handwritten note from the Henderson family. And he realized he did not want to go back. Not to the Germany he had left anyway. That Germany was gone. What remained was a shattered country that would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. Some prisoners took this realization to its logical extreme. Georg Gertner, a young private captured in North Africa, escaped from a camp in New Mexico in 1945. But he did not flee to Mexico or try to return to Germany. Instead, he disappeared into the American landscape, working under assumed names, learning English, and eventually settling in California. He lived there for 40 years before finally revealing his true identity in 1985. By then, he was an American in every way that mattered. Reinhold Pabel, a Luftwaffe officer, escaped from a camp in Illinois and spent 5 years living illegally in Chicago. He worked as a dishwasher, then a bookkeeper, immersing himself in American life. When he was finally discovered and deported in 1953, he expressed regret not at being caught, but at having to leave. These men, and others like them, had made a choice. They preferred life in the country that had defeated them to the ideology that had sent them to war. The re-education program bore fruit in ways the Americans could not have predicted. When the prisoners finally returned to Germany in 1946 and 1947, they carried with them something more valuable than food or clothing. They carried ideas. Many became leaders in the reconstruction of West Germany. They brought with them the principles they had learned in captivity: democratic self-governance, the rule of law, the value of dissent, and the recognition that strength did not require cruelty. Hartmann returned to Stuttgart in the summer of 1946. The city was unrecognizable. Allied bombing had reduced much of it to rubble. His family's farm was still standing, but his father was dead, killed in an air raid in 1944. His mother and sister had survived, living in the farmhouse with little food and less hope. He told them about America, about the factories that stretched for miles, about the abundance that seemed inexhaustible, about the Christmas gifts and the women singing in German while his mother listened in silence. Hartmann eventually became a schoolteacher, like Keller. He taught history to children who had no memory of the Reich, who grew up in a Germany that was democratic, prosperous, and allied with the very nations it had once fought. He never forgot his time in Texas. He kept the handwritten note from the Henderson family in a drawer, yellowed and fragile, a reminder of the moment his understanding of the world had shattered and been rebuilt. The ultimate victory was not achieved through destruction. It was achieved through the quiet, persistent demonstration that another way was possible, that enemies could become friends. Through families who sent letters and kindness to men who had once been defined only as enemies. The German prisoners who returned home carried that lesson with them. And in the decades that followed, as West Germany rose from the ashes to become a pillar of democratic Europe, the seeds planted in those Texas camps bore fruit in ways no one could have imagined. Mercy was not weakness, but a form of strength that could transform even those who had been taught to hate.